I want to conclude this special transmission with an interview with Peter Dale Scott, an amazing historian, professor, researcher, the author of scores of books. He really wrote the original definitive works exposing CIA drug trafficking, of course, in Vietnam, and then in Latin America. He's an expert on Iran, Contra, and more. And he's got two new books out. American War Machine is his newest, and then, of course, The Road to 9/11. But I wanted to get him on today because recently we have seen a group of filmmakers who were able to interview Richard Clarke and others being threatened by the CIA if they release the names of CIA agents they discovered were basically involved in covering up the identity of the hijackers pre-9/11. This is pretty powerful stuff, and joining us is Peter Dale Scott to discuss it. Peter, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to be on the show again. You know, it's a matter of two names who are not big names in the whole story. The big names in the story, Richard Blee and Tom Wilshire, we've known for some time now, and particularly the name of Richard Blee was discovered in a book by, this is a very important book here, Kevin Fenton. He's a Briton living in Prague, Czechoslovakia, and he's written a whole book about how the CIA withheld information from the FBI. The two names that were sensitive to the CIA are part of the story, but not a big part of the story. Richard Blee is absolutely central to it, because he was high up in the CIA's bin Laden unit, and he was also obviously a hawk. He had been pushing for a program to get the CIA on the ground with the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan for months before 9/11 happened. So that it's very striking that on the one hand, he's withholding information that could have stopped 9/11 from happening. That's a general consensus from everybody, that this was vital information. If the FBI had had it, they could have brought in some, maybe the majority of the hijackers. Then on the other hand, he's acting as if he wanted 9/11 to go forward, and at the same time, he's preparing a plan for what to do when there's a casus belli, and it's essentially what they did do. They went in on behalf of the Northern Alliance, which was quite controversial because everyone knew that the Northern Alliance was an army supporting itself by drug trafficking.
Speaking of drug trafficking, now we see Geraldo Rivera on Fox, we see ABC News, we see BBC. I mean, I've played these clips here on air where they just admit now, okay, the troops help grow the opium and we help ship it out and we give them fertilizer, and then we worry about it once it gets to America or once it gets to Europe. And we've seen what, in the last 10 years, it go from 9% of world production, according to our own Justice Department, to 92% of world opium, then produced into heroin coming out of Afghanistan. And now, back when you were exposing it in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and Gary Webb was exposing it, they would still somewhat try to deny it. Now they just say, yeah, we grow the opium. It's no big deal. And I was telling you off air, now the El Paso Times, Chicago Tribune have confirmed with the federal documents that indeed most of the big Mexican drug cartels are allowed to ship drugs in, and it's only the cowboys that are shut down, and that our own government shipping guns into Mexico to knock out the drug dealers' competition, and it just looks exactly like Iran-Contra all over again.
Well, for 50 years, the CIA has wanted to exercise its clout in parts of the world where there are no U.S. Army troops, and so they rely on drug proxy armies. And they started this initially in Southeast Asia, the Golden Triangle, back around 1950. And this was written about by Al McCoy in his book, The Politics of Heroin. But what Al didn't really convey is the extent to which CIA support for these armies built up the trade so that the Golden Triangle went from less than 40 tons a year. It was very minor in the world markets before the war. And then by the height of the Vietnam War, it was somewhere between 600 and 1,200 tons. And then when that shut down, almost immediately, you get the Golden Crescent starting up, and lo and behold, the CIA is there too. And again, it's the CIA support for the drug trafficking mujahideen. They weren't all drug traffickers by any means, but most of the CIA support went to the mujahideen who were the drug traffickers. And we see this explosive increase from maybe 100, 200 tons back in 1980 to a high of 8,200 tons in 2006. It's down a little bit, but most of what's being grown in Afghanistan right now, it gets blamed on the Taliban and the U.S. press, but only about 12% of it is Taliban drugs. By far, the bulk of it is in the corrupt system that's headed by Hamid Karzai in Kabul.
Exactly. Even the New York Times admits Karzai's late brother was the main opium kingpin. But there's this Orwellian, absurdist, just beyond ridiculous, where they're sending people to jail for a small amount of narcotics here in this country. And then meanwhile, there's congressional hearings in the late 90s about CIA drug trafficking that your work and others helped expose, Gary Webb, of course. Now they've just got Geraldo.
Tons, yes. You know, when the CIA is involved, it's in the tons. If I could just recall, it was late 90s. It was the DEA discovered that there was a Venezuelan General Guillen Davila. They accused him of importing a ton of cocaine with CIA approval. The Wall Street Journal said it might have been as much as 22 tons. And the man was technically indicted, but it was a sealed indictment. Nothing ever came of it. And we next heard of the man as part of a CIA plot against Hugo Chavez about 4 or 5 years ago, untouched. And the CIA guy who was implicated in that, and the DEA wanted to see him indicted, he was allowed to retire without any penalty whatsoever. This was big time stuff. This is tons. And as you say, the courts are filled with people dealing with ounces.
Well, I mean, expanding on that with the Sinaloa cartel declaring they work for the CIA, and then, sure enough, the government came in and said, yes, this is true, national security. I mean, that just came out last week. And so how do the cops, how do the average people out there who are kicking down doors looking for marijuana, how do they rationalize this when basically it's now an open secret that the majority of narcotics shipped into this country are brought in by CIA-authorized contractors and cartels, and really the only people being busted that are of any large size are cowboys? I mean, there's no doubt that's happening. They've made drugs illegal because prohibition ended of alcohol. They needed a new business. By making it illegal, it increases the price. How long can this phony war on drugs go as we see it destroying our society?
I know they've spent over $1 trillion in this war on drugs, and we've only seen the consumption rates go up. I do think it's very obvious that a first step should be to legalize marijuana, because that would take the profits out of the Mexican cartels. They don't grow cocaine there. They grow marijuana, and if people could grow their own, they would be smoking a healthier commodity than what they get, for which is, you know, hyped up and laced with other drugs and so on. But this is argued for by a lot of medical experts just on medical grounds. But the objection, the reason it's not happening is political, because the high prices of drugs is sustaining a complete narco economy, which is important to the CIA. Now it's important to the DEA, because that's what keeps them in business. And it's important, of course, to U.S. banks, who are laundering the bulk of the profits from this illegal drug trade.
That was my next point. 20 years ago, you would get criticized, and other researchers would. But now you've got to feel completely vindicated when it came out, as you know, last year, that Wachovia and Wells Fargo laundered in a 2.5-year period $376 billion of narcotics money, and even leased and ran the big aircraft to fly the stuff around. I mean, and then they paid a
tons of cocaine. Yeah, they paid a fine for having financed a shipment of 22 tons of cocaine. I think the 384 billion is what they were required by law to keep tabs on and didn't. But they pleaded guilty to 112 million of drug money laundering, and that doesn't make them the big player here. According to a Canadian authority, every single major bank on Wall Street has been getting rich by laundering these funds.
Well, no kidding. And so the issue here is the big banks are full of this money, and they're not getting in trouble. And the big issue was they were, leasing the aircraft and actually involved in the technicals of this. In closing, 10 years after 9/11, we see the police state getting worse, the TSA, the checkpoints on the streets, the face scanning cameras. In closing, Peter Dale Scott, looking at the war machine, clearly needing a new threat. That's why you've written the new book, American War Machine. And, of course, it is the road to 9/11. What has 9/11 done to America and the rest of the world? What has that myth done?
Well, we can talk. It's certainly, I'd like just to mention, it's not just 9/11, but it's these COG, continuity of government regulations that were implemented on 9/11, which the media never talk about, but which actually prescribed a regime for suspending the Constitution in certain respects. And that's why we got the Patriot Act and why we got the suspension of FISA, why we got warrantless detention and the Homeland Security's 10-year program, Project Endgame, to build detention camps to deal with millions of people if necessary. And the budget for that program was $400 million in just one of the 10 fiscal years at stake. So one can be very bleak about this, but I'd rather close on a more upbeat note, because I think that the whole 9/11 story is really beginning to come apart. We're getting some very good science now to show that there was nanothermite that helped blow up Building 7 and the Twin Towers. We're getting this book again by Kevin Fenton, which is about the illegal withholding of information from the FBI. This is a story that's going way beyond the 9/11 truth movement, bringing in major journalists, and I think we're going to get congressional action on this, and I will be really disgusted with Congress if we don't.
Well, I'm glad you raised that point, because as we investigate, we find more and more, just like Sybil Edmonds, who's now broken her gag order in the last year, was able to document the FBI translator. It was narcotics, it was weapons, it was sex slavery, Al-Qaeda involved with the CIA, up until the day of 9/11. I mean, this is just organized crime. And we do have a few minutes left. I'm glad you brought up COG. There's so many things that you've been a leading expert in, but that's probably what you've trailblazed to the greatest extent from my research. And I was about to raise the point when you brought up COG that it's basically already been implemented. That's how you see the Constitution being set aside. That's how you see Obama saying, I can launch wars without congressional approval. That's how you see warrantless wiretapping and more FEMA in our local communities. I have reporters, we just had them on earlier, out in the field in Denver right now, where they're practicing putting people in the local sports stadium. And out of hundreds of drills going on at this event and over 100 agencies, that was the only thing they didn't advertise and that they don't want press at, but we were able to get in and talk to participants, and it is just so frightening. And then you've got Glenn Beck coming out and saying we're liars, it doesn't exist, when meanwhile they have the Emergency Centers Establishment Act, we have the FEMA purchase orders for the emergency camps, we have Rex 84, the Iran-Contra hearings admitting it, with Congressman Jack Brooks raising it, and they say that's national security, don't talk about it. Miami Herald's reported on it, you wrote about it 20-something years ago. And then you're talking about Houston Chronicle articles where they admit the $400 million, that was years ago, for camps and civil emergency. We raise facts, and they stonewall and say, camps? There's no such thing as camps. Meanwhile, I've got reporters on the ground witnessing them drilling to put political dissidents in camps, Peter. So in a few minutes here, tell folks what's...
Homeland Security used to have it on their website until I wrote about it, and then they took it off their website. The thing that's public, it's hard to talk about COG because, of course, it's all super secret. We know that Bush brought in some new COG rules in 2007, and the Homeland Security Committee of the House wasn't allowed to see the rules. They were told they didn't have a high enough clearance to see those rules. That's a pretty good sign that the Constitution's going crazy just there.